The cold autumn rain fell in sheets, turning the Castilian plains into a sea of mud. It clung to the black velvet of the queen's gown, soaking her to the bone, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes, wide and unervingly bright, were fixed on the lead-lined coffin before her. Inside lay her husband, her beautiful Philip, struck down by a fever weeks ago. Yet, for Queen Joanna, he wasn't gone. He was merely sleeping. The procession had halted for the night. A grim caravan of courtiers and guard huddled against the storm, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. They whisper behind their hands, staring at their queen who refused to seek shelter, who refused to be parted from the dead. She would permit the coffin to be opened, just for a moment, so she could gaze upon his still perfect face and kiss his cold feet. This was not just grief. It was something far more terrifying, an obsession that had already cost her a kingdom and was about to cost her everything else. Her story is not a fairy tale of a princess in a tower. It is a harrowing, true account of a woman betrayed by everyone she ever loved, a queen whose passion was used as a weapon to lock her away from the world. Her name was Joanna of Castile, and they would call her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But was she truly insane, or was she the victim of the most calculated, cruel, and successful character assassination in royal history? If you believe in uncovering the true, often tragic, stories of those who lived before us, take a moment to subscribe and follow our journey into the darkest corridors of the past. She was a scholar in a world that demanded saints and soldiers, a quiet girl with an astonishing intellect, more comfortable in a library than a throne room. Born Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the Catholic monarchs who had forged Spain in fire and faith, the Infanta Joanna's life was never her own. It was a strategic asset, a piece to be moved on the great chessboard of European power. From her birth, her path was predetermined, culminating in a marriage designed to encircle their great rival, France. The groom was Archduke Philip of Habsburg, son of the Holy Roman Emperor, a man she had never met, who lived in a land she had never seen. The sea that carried her away from the austere, sun-baked plains of Castile was cold and unforgiving, a gray expanse separating her from everything she had ever known. She was sailing toward a duty, a political pact sealed in a velvet-lined cage. But when she finally stood before him in Flanders, the careful architecture of politics crumbled in an instant. He was golden-haired, athletic, the living embodiment of Renaissance chivalry. They called him Philip the Handsome, and the title did not do him justice. When their eyes met, the rigid formality of the Burgundian court simply dissolved. The air crackled, the carefully planned introductions and political niceties were forgotten. Legend claims they demanded a priest be found at once, consummating their marriage that very night, unable to endure a moment's separation. In that moment, duty was incinerated by desire. It was a love that felt like a divine revelation, a force of nature, but a fire that burned so brightly can provide immense warmth, or it can consume everything in its path. For a time, their passion was the envy of Europe, a whirlwind of devotion that produced children and seemed to defy the cold calculus of royal alliances. Joanna had given her entire self to this love, an absolute surrender of heart and soul. In the hedonistic Burgundian court, however, a world of lavish feasts and looser morals, Philip's fidelity was not as absolute. He was a creature of appetite, accustomed to admiration and the casual affections of courtly ladies. To him, these were meaningless flirtations, the expected sport of a powerful archduke. But to Joanna, who had built her entire world upon the foundation of their singular connection, each rumored affair, each lingering glance he gave to another woman, was not a mere indiscretion. It was a seismic tremor that threatened to bring her universe crashing down. Her reactions were not the quiet, dignified tears of a wronged queen. They were storms, public confrontations, fits of screaming rage, and a possessiveness so intense it startled the courtiers around her. In the rigid, pious court of Spain, her passion might have been understood, but here, in the whispering halls of Flanders, it was seen as something else, something foreign, unstable. Her Spanish attendants were sent away, leaving her isolated, surrounded by strangers who answered to her husband. The love that had been her liberation was fast becoming a new kind of prison, one where the bars were forged from her own fierce heart, and her jailers were beginning to take note, watching as a woman they called passionate began to look more and more like the woman they would soon call Mad. The news arrived like a winter frost in late autumn, carried on a ship from a sunnier, harsher land. Her mother, Isabella the Catholic, was dead. With that single devastating blow, the world shifted beneath Joanna's feet. She was no longer just an infanta, an archduchess living in the shadow of her powerful parents. She was now Joanna I, Queen of Castile, sovereign of a vast and powerful kingdom. And in that moment, the inheritance felt not like a destiny, but a curse. The crown she was to inherit was not made of gold, but of thorns, and it would be pressed upon her brow by the two men who should have been her greatest protectors. In Flanders, her husband Philip saw not a grieving daughter, but a golden opportunity. The flash of triumph in his eyes was unmistakable. He was now the husband of the queen, the de facto ruler of one of Europe's richest realms. He saw her tears not as a sign of loss, but as proof of a fragile temperament that required his firm, guiding hand. Miles away in Spain, her father Ferdinand, the old wolf of Aragon, felt the power he had shared with his wife for decades slipping through his fingers. He had no intention of ceding control of Castile to a flighty daughter and her grasping, foreign husband. She was the board upon which they would play their savage game. They landed in Castile not as unified monarchs, but as rival players in a game for a single throne. Philip immediately began to work on the powerful Castilian nobility, presenting himself as a sane, capable, and masculine force needed to govern. He was charming and decisive, while his wife, he hinted, was delicate, unpredictable. He encouraged her isolation, controlled her access to counselors, and spoke for her in matters of state. Every ounce of her passionate nature, the very quality that had once enchanted him, was now twisted into a symptom of illness. Her grief for her mother was pathologized as melancholic hysteria. Her entirely justified rage at his blatant infidelities was presented as unhinged jealousy. From Aragon, her father Ferdinand played his part with chilling precision. He sent letters filled with feigned concern, spreading rumors of her instability, suggesting a regency was necessary to protect the kingdom. It was a quiet, monstrous agreement forged between the two most powerful men in her life. To paint the queen as mad was to render her powerless. The crown sat upon her head, but its weight was crushing her. She was surrounded by enemies who wore the faces of family, trapped in a conspiracy of whispers where her own mind was being used as the primary weapon against her. The architecture of her supposed insanity was being built, brick by brick, right before her eyes. It came with the speed of an assassin's blade, not a lingering illness. One moment, Philippa Handsome, a titan of youth and vigor after a game of pelota, was vibrant and alive. The next, he was burning with a violent fever. Within days, he was dead. In the stunned, suffocating silence of the palace in Burgos, whispers of poison slithered through the court. The name on everyone's lips, a venomous secret, was Ferdinand, her father. But Joanna did not collapse into a storm of tears as she had so many times before. Her reaction was something far stranger, far more chilling, a profound and unnerving stillness. She was now the sole, undisputed ruler of Castile, yet the power meant nothing. The man who had been the sun in her sky had been extinguished. She refused to allow his body to be interred. This was not a negotiation. It was a royal command. She had the lead-lined coffin brought to her chambers, where she kept a constant, sleepless vigil beside it. The stench of death was held at bay by heavy perfumes and embalming herbs, but the cold finality of him could not be disguised. Courtiers watched in silent terror as she ordered the casket opened, again and again, just to gaze upon his waxen face, to touch his lifeless hands. She would speak to him in soft whispers, convinced he was only sleeping, certain he would awaken to her devotion. The world saw a mind finally fractured beyond repair. But inside her own reality, she was simply a wife, refusing to abandon her husband. Burgos could no longer hold her. She announced they were leaving, beginning a long journey south to Granada, where she intended to bury Philip beside her mother. And so began one of the most bizarre and sorrowful spectacles in European history. The procession moved only at night. Joanna declared that a widow who had lost a son of her own soul had no business traveling in the light of day. A river of black velvet and flickering torchlight snaked its way across the frozen plains of Castile, a shadowy caravan led by a queen who would not sleep. Each night, the heavy, lead-lined coffin was brought into her chambers. Each morning, it was loaded back onto the ornate carriage drawn by 4 black horses. This grim pilgrimage was governed by her obsessive jealousy. No woman was permitted to approach the carriage. On one occasion, the exhausted procession sought refuge for the night in what they thought was a monastery, only to discover it was a convent of nuns. Joanna flew into a wild panic, a fury that terrified her attendants. She ordered the coffin taken back out into the freezing night immediately, refusing to let her husband's body rest for even a moment under the same roof as other women. Her jealousy had outlived its object, becoming a spectral guard that watched over his remains. For nearly 2 years, this was her kingdom. The creak of the carriage wheels, the smell of incense and decay, and the silent, cold companionship of the dead king she refused to let go. The long, dark journey had to end. With Philip finally interred in the royal chapel of Granada, Joanna's last, desperate claim to agency was over. The physical anchor of her grief was gone, and in its place was a terrifying vacuum. Her father, Ferdinand, wasted no time. He swooped in, not as a grieving father-in-law, but as a calculated custodian of power. He had the letters, the eyewitness accounts, the carefully curated narrative of her instability. With the full authority of the Castilian Cortes, he was declared her guardian and the kingdom's regent. Her fate was sealed not with a crown, but with a lock and key. The chosen location was a masterpiece of cruel irony, the royal palace convent of Santa Clara at Tordesillas. It was no dark dungeon, but a sprawling, beautiful complex overlooking the wide, slow-moving River Douro. From her barred windows, she could see the changing seasons, the boats drifting by, the vast, open sky of Castile. The beauty of the view was a daily torment, a constant, silent reminder of a world she could see but never again touch. The heavy wooden doors closed behind her, and the sound echoed with a terrible finality. She was Queen of Castile, and yet she was a prisoner, stripped of her power, her freedom, and her children. The gilded cage had become a stone one. The days bled into one another, marked only by the tolling of the convent bells and the slow crawl of sunlight across her stone floor. Time, for a prisoner, is not a river but a stagnant pool. Her son, Charles, was now a man, the most powerful ruler in Christendom, the Holy Roman Emperor. But to his mother, he was an abstraction, a name and a letter, a distant authority who sanctioned her confinement. Her keepers, the Marquis of Denia and his wife, were her only human contact, and their reports to the emperor painted a consistent, damning portrait. The queen remained unstable, prone to fits of rage and religious apathy, unfit to ever leave her gilded prison. They controlled her food, her company, her access to the outside world, creating the very conditions of her despair, and then reporting it as evidence of her madness. Her one fragile link to life was her youngest daughter, Catherine, or Catalina, who had been brought into the prison as an infant. She was a flicker of warmth in the suffocating cold, a child who grew up knowing only the convent walls and the profound, bottomless grief of her mother. Joanna clung to her with a desperate, ferocious love, terrified that this last piece of her heart would be torn away, too. For years, this was her world. The echoing silence, the watchful eyes of her jailers, and the small hand of a daughter who was a fellow captive. The fiery, passionate queen who had crossed the sea for love was being slowly, methodically erased, becoming a ghost who haunted her own life. She died on a Good Friday in the spring of 1555. She was 75 years old, having spent nearly 50 of those years entombed within the silent walls of Tordesillas. The stone had leached the fire from her veins, and the world she had been born into, a world of nascent empires and fierce faith, had transformed into something she would not have recognized. Her son, the Emperor Charles V, had risen, ruled, and already abdicated. A silence fell, not of peace, but of erasure. The difficult, inconvenient queen was finally gone. But her death was not an ending. It was a coronation of a different sort. It was a moment the woman, Joanna, vanished completely, and the myth, Juana la Loca, was etched permanently into the stone of history. The story that echoed down the centuries was the one her captors had written. It was a simple, powerful tale of a woman undone by love, a queen whose mind was too fragile for a crown, a cautionary fable of female hysteria. This narrative was incredibly useful. For her father, Ferdinand, it had justified his regency and secured his hold on Castile. For her son, Charles, it legitimized his own rule, which began while his mother, the rightful queen, was still very much alive. Her madness was a foundational stone upon which their power was built. Her tragedy became their justification. Her suffering a political convenience. The architects of her ruin were also the authors of her history. But in the centuries since, a different story has begun to surface, a whisper from the locked rooms of Tordesillas. Historians and psychologists now look back through the clouded lens of time and see not a madwoman, but a victim of almost unimaginable psychological torment. They see a woman likely suffering from severe clinical depression, perhaps exacerbated by a series of difficult childbirths. They see a soul shattered by profound grief, and a mind systematically broken by the relentless gaslighting of the men she trusted most. Was her obsessive jealousy not the desperate cry of a woman whose only source of love and identity was flagrantly unfaithful in a foreign court that isolated her? Was her rage not the righteous fury of a queen being stripped of her crown, her children, and her very selfhood? In a brutal, misogynistic age, a woman's passion was a liability. Her emotional depth a weapon that could be turned against her. The name they gave her, Juana la Loca, was not a medical diagnosis. It was a political sentence. It was a final turn of the key in the lock, the one that imprisoned her not just in body, but in memory, ensuring her power will remain in the hands of men. Her story is a chilling reminder that the loudest voices in history books are often those of the jailers. But sometimes, if we listen closely enough to the noise of 500 years, we can still hear the echo of the prisoner, telling us a different, more tragic truth.